Tonight, on Fear NOX, we follow the waterline where houses outlast families, and ice forms before the calendar admits it. 10 first-hand accounts from dockhands, inspectors, EMTs, and winter caretakers, pulled from incident logs, marina cameras, VHF recordings, and notes left inside boathouse ledgers. From the Great Lakes to New England ponds to Alaskan coves, shoulder season sets the air at 30-something and the decks a degree colder. You'll hear lantern glass tick as it cools, see ladders iced one rung too soon, and watch shore lights reflect where no surface should be. No spoilers, just what was written, heard, or measured. Subscribe and hit the bell. If you've walked a dock after dark, you'll recognize the sounds. These are real places and real procedures. Just listen close. Drop your own story below. We read them all. All right, let's get into it. For 15 years, I've been the winter caretaker for a dozen properties around this deep Maine pond. My territory stretches from the old logging road on the west shore to the granite cliffs on the east, a good 10 miles by snowmobile when the ice isn't safe. My routine is etched into the landscape. Tuesday mornings, I load the Arctic Cat, check the fuel, pack the thermal imager, a spare set of keys, and my logbook. The goal is simple: keep the pipes from freezing, the snow from collapsing roofs, and the seasonal homes secure until spring. It's a solitary job mostly, just me and the cold. But that's the appeal. There's a certain peace in the quiet hum of the machine and the vast, still silence of the woods. My core protocol, the one that keeps everything running smoothly and keeps me out of trouble, is straightforward. Every lock checked is a lock secured. Every window, every door, every crawl space access point is verified. If I find something amiss, I document it, photograph it, and report it. The logbook is my Bible, a meticulous record of dates, times, temperatures, and observations. These properties are static between my visits. Any deviation, no matter how minor, is a red flag. The boathouse on the North Shore property, owned by the family who spends their winters in Florida, is always the last stop on my Tuesday route. It's a sturdy cedar structure, built on pilings, with a small dock that gets pulled up onto the shore for the winter freeze. Inside, the family keeps a few canoes, a small fishing skiff, and a collection of antique tackle. I always check the lock on the main door, ensure the vents aren't blocked, and make a note in the ledger they keep nailed to a beam just inside the entrance. It's a tradition, a way for the owners to track visits and leave notes for the occasional contractor. My last entry, 7 days prior, noted, boathouse secured. Temp 28F, no issues. This particular Tuesday, the air was still and sharp, the kind of cold that feels like it could shatter glass. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, and the snow on the trees sparkled with a million tiny crystals. As I approached the North Shore property, the snowmobile's engine note a low thrum in the profound silence. I saw it. A soft yellow glow emanating from the boathouse windows. My first thought was a power surge, maybe a timer malfunction. But the owners always disconnected the main power to the boathouse for the winter, leaving only a trickle for a single outdoor security light, which was off. This light was definitely inside. I cut the engine, the sudden quiet deafening. My breath plumed white, hanging in the frigid air. I walked the 100 yards to the boathouse door, my boots crunching on the packed snow. The padlock, a heavy brass master lock, was still secured. No signs of forced entry. My heart rate picked up, a dull thud against my ribs. I pulled out my ring of keys, selected the boathouse key, and unlocked the padlock. The cold metal bit into my gloved hand. The air inside was stale, cold, but undeniably warmer than outside. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling was indeed on, casting long, distorted shadows of the stored boats. I scanned the interior with my flashlight, then the thermal imager. No heat signatures, no signs of recent activity. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Canoes stacked, fishing skiff covered, tackle boxes neatly arranged. The cedar planks of the interior walls gave off that faint, clean scent I always associated with these old structures. I walked over to the ledger, a worn leather-bound book impaled on a nail on the main support beam. I flipped it open to the last entry, my own from a week ago. Below it, in a hand I didn't recognize, a flowing, almost elegant script, not the owner's blocky scrawl, was a single line. Leave the ladder down. I stared at it. The ink was fresh, certainly not a week old. It looked like it had been written within the last day or two. My mind raced. No one else had keys. No one else was supposed to be here. The owners were in Florida. I tried calling the main owner, but his phone went straight to voicemail, as it usually did during the winter months. I left a message explaining the situation, trying to keep my voice neutral. Something's off at the boathouse, sir. Light was on. Found a note. I checked the dock ladder. It was, as always, pulled up and secured on the boathouse wall, out of the ice. Standard procedure for winter. The note clearly contradicted this. I stood there for a long moment, the hum of the single bulb the only sound. Part of me wanted to pull the ladder down, just to see. Another part, the part trained in procedure, screamed against it. Every instinct told me to secure the premises, turn off the light, and report the anomaly. But the note. It felt like a direct request. A test, maybe, from the owner. I'd made a small mistake once, years ago, forgetting to lock a shed, and had been reminded of the importance of diligence. Was this a new kind of test? Against my better judgment, against the protocol ingrained into me for years, I left the light on. And I took the heavy cedar ladder, usually a two-person job, and carefully lowered it. It clattered gently onto the thin ice that had begun to form around the pilings, a delicate fringe thin as glass. I secured the boathouse door, locked the padlock, and made my entry in the logbook. Boathouse light on. Found note. Ladder lowered per instruction. No signs of forced entry. The entry felt inadequate, almost foolish. I spent the rest of the day feeling a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you've done something you shouldn't have. The next Tuesday, the cold was even more profound. The sky was a bruised purple gray, promising more snow. The wind had picked up, whispering through the skeletal trees. As I approached the North Shore property, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The yellow glow was still there, unwavering in the boathouse windows. It had been on for a full week. I cut the engine. The padlock was still secured, but the ladder I had lowered a week ago was now resting squarely on the ice, its base submerged slightly where it had broken through the delicate surface. It looked like it had been used. I unlocked the door, the cold metal biting. The light was still on. The air inside felt colder than last week, despite the bulb. I walked to the ledger. My previous entry was still there. Below it, there was nothing new. No further instructions. Just the previous line. Leave the ladder down. Now underlined twice. The ink looked even fresher than before. It was a darker shade, as if pressed harder into the page. I checked the thermal imager again, sweeping the boathouse. Nothing. No residual heat. No living thing. I checked the small utility box outside, where the main power cutoff was. The meter was barely ticking over, just enough to power a single bulb, but a single bulb, left on for a week, should have generated some warmth, or at least not have the interior feel colder. My breath hung in the air, a dense cloud that didn't drift. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint creak of the boathouse in the wind. I walked to the edge of the dock inside the boathouse, looking down at the water. The ice around the pilings was thin as glass, just as it had been last week. But now, at the base of the ladder, there was a small area of disturbed ice, where it had clearly rested. There were no tracks in the snow leading from the boathouse to the main property, or anywhere else. The only tracks were my own from a week ago, now half filled with fresh powder. I remembered one summer, decades ago, sitting on this very dock with my grandfather, fishing for sunfish. The sun warm on my face, the smell of lake water and pine needles, the gentle tug on my line. It was a simple, uncomplicated memory. A stark contrast to the cold, inexplicable reality I was facing now. I stood there, staring at the underlined note, at the ladder resting on the ice, at the persistent, useless light. There was no logical explanation. No one could have accessed the boathouse without leaving a trace, without disturbing the locks, without leaving tracks in the fresh snow. Yet, the ladder had been moved, the light remained on, and the note had been re-emphasized. My protocol, my reliance on observable facts and logical sequences, had failed. The static nature of these properties had been violated by something that left no evidence, only a silent, impossible request. I pulled the ladder back up, securing it to the wall. I turned off the light. I locked the boat. I've been an EMT in the Finger Lakes region for 12 years. You get to know the roads, the seasonal shifts, the way the lake breathes in and out with the weather. My rig is usually stocked for anything from a twisted ankle on a hiking trail to a multi-vehicle pileup on the highway. Tonight, though, I was running on a different kind of call. It was late October, past midnight, and a frost fog was rolling in, thick and heavy off the water. My body cam was clipped to my vest, the radio crackling low, and the tablet on the dash glowed with the details of the dispatch. The call came in as an open line 911. Standard procedure for these is to treat them as a potential emergency until proven otherwise. Dispatch notes were already populated. Caller ID, 419 Shoreline Road. Carrier tone stuttered, then cleared. Sound of lake chop, then voice counting backward. Unconfirmed distress. The address itself was a red flag. I pulled up the property details on my tablet. It was a private cottage, typically used seasonally. A quick glance at the county records confirmed it. Property winterized October 12th. No occupants expected. That detail tightened something in my chest. A winterized cottage shouldn't be generating 911 calls, especially not an open line with lake sounds and a voice counting. I confirmed the address with dispatch, lights and siren off as I turned onto the gravel drive. The winding road was slick with damp leaves, and the frost fog ahead was like a white wall. The air tasted of damp earth and a faint, almost sweet pine smell from the woods bordering the property. The cottage itself was dark, a black silhouette against the milky fog. No lights on, no car in the driveway. I parked the ambulance, killed the engine, and stepped out into the biting cold. My breath plumed. The silence here was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic shush of the lake. I drew my service weapon, holding it at low ready, and activated my body cam. "Unit 1 on scene at 419 Shoreline Road," I radioed, my voice tight. "House appears dark, no activity. Proceeding to investigate." My initial instinct, conditioned by years of responding to residential addresses, was to check the front door. I moved cautiously, boots crunching on the frosted gravel. The porch was empty, the door locked tight, no signs of forced entry. I swept my flashlight beam across the windows, seeing only reflections of the fog. It was then that I remembered the specific detail from dispatch. Sound of lake chop. Why would a call from the house have prominent lake sounds? My focus had been too narrow, a small lapse in judgment from fatigue. I should have scanned the entire property perimeter first. I pivoted, sweeping my light across the backyard, towards where the lake would be. The fog was denser here, swallowing the landscape. But a faint glint caught my eye. The metallic sheen of aluminum. I moved towards it, pushing through tall, brittle reeds that scraped against my pants. The ground sloped gently, leading directly to the water. There it was, an aluminum ramp, the kind used to launch small boats or jet skis. It stretched from the bank, across the narrow strip of frosted beach, and disappeared into the black water. The surface of the ramp was slick with moisture, but clearly visible on its metal slats were distinct impressions. Heel prints. Not just scuffs, but deep, clear impressions, as if someone had walked deliberately, heel first, down the ramp. And they led only one way, into the dark, unseen water. My heart hammered. This wasn't a house call. This was a dock. I knelt, shining my light directly onto the prints. They were fresh, the frost disturbed around their edges. The size suggested an adult. Male or female, impossible to tell, but the stride was even, unhurried. The lake chop was louder here, a constant, lapping sound against the shore. "Dispatch, Unit 1. I'm at the dock. I have clear heel prints leading into the water. No person visible. Requesting Marine Patrol and Sheriff backup immediately." The response was swift. "Copy, Unit 1. Marine Patrol and Sheriff en route. ETA 10 minutes. Can you confirm any other details from your position?" I stood, sweeping my light across the water. The fog was a shroud, making visibility near zero beyond a few feet. "Negative, dispatch. Just the prints. Water is black. No boat, no personal effects on the dock or shore. Just the prints." I paused, listening intently. The lake chop was relentless, but I strained to hear anything else, any voice, any struggle. Nothing. I thought about the dispatch notes again. Voice counting backward. I hadn't heard it on the scene. I radioed again. "Dispatch, can you reconfirm the audio from the open line? Specifically the counting." A few seconds of static, then the dispatcher's voice, slightly strained. "Unit 1, reconfirming." Our recording picked up a voice, faint but distinct. It started from 5, then 4, 3, 2. Then it just cut to lake chop. No 1, no further numbers. The missing 1 chilled me more than the counting itself. It implied a sudden final end to the sequence. I imagined the person, walking steadily down the ramp, counting aloud, their voice swallowed by the water on the last number. Backup arrived, the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser and a marine patrol truck cutting through the fog. The air horn of the patrol boat pierced the night as it launched from a nearby public ramp, heading towards our location. The Marine Patrol officer, a grizzled veteran, took one look at the ramp and the prints. "Well, that's not good," he stated, his voice flat. They deployed sonar, their powerful searchlights sweeping the water. The sheriff's deputy canvassed the cottage again, double-checking windows and doors, looking for any sign of a struggle or a note. Nothing. The cottage remained sealed, silent, and dark. As the search continued, fruitless in the dense fog and dark water, I found myself staring at the ramp. I remembered being a kid, maybe 10 years old, jumping off a dock into this very lake on a scorching summer day. The shock of the cold water, the rush of exhilaration, the feeling of freedom. That memory, usually a comforting one, now felt perverse, a stark contrast to the grim reality of those heel prints. Hours passed. The sonar showed nothing but the lake bed. The searchlights only illuminated the impenetrable fog. The sheriff confirmed the landline at 419 Shoreline Road was indeed active, despite the property being winterized. That was the final, baffling piece of the puzzle. How could a call from a landline in a locked, winterized house originate from a dock, with a voice counting backward, only to vanish into the lake? By dawn, the search was called off. No body, no evidence of a boat, no personal items, no note. Just the prints on the aluminum ramp, now smudged and indistinct from the activity, and the chilling audio recording of a voice counting down to nothing. The case was filed as an unexplained disappearance, with possible intentional immersion noted. The landline at 419 Shoreline Road was disconnected that morning. I still think about those heel prints sometimes, especially when the frost fog rolls in. The image of them, so clear, so deliberate, leading into the black water. And the sound of that voice, counting backward, always stopping just before 1. As a state inspector for environmental compliance, I've spent the better part of 15 years scrutinizing infrastructure across the Great Lakes region. My work often involves reviewing incident reports, checking logs, and sometimes sifting through hours of security footage. This particular morning, the report detailed a missing lock from the fuel shed at the North Point Marina, a facility I know well, tucked into a deep bay on Lake Superior. The call came in at 07:15. Marina staff discovered the shed door ajar, the heavy-duty padlock gone. No signs of forced entry, no pry marks, no damage to the hasp. Just missing. This immediately flagged the incident as unusual. Standard procedure dictates a thorough review of all available surveillance. I drove the 90 minutes through a pre-dawn drizzle, arriving as the sky grudgingly lightened to a dull gray. The marina office was cold, smelling faintly of stale coffee. The marina's CCTV system, while dated, was functional. I sat down at the monitor, pulling up the footage from the fuel dock camera, which was equipped with audio. The time frame for review was set from 000 to 040, covering the overnight hours. My protocol is always to cross-reference visual data with the facility's night log. Rule number 1 in fuel security: if personnel are on site after hours, it's recorded. Every entry, every timestamp, every authorized individual. The marina's log for the previous night showed no scheduled crews, no maintenance, no unexpected call-outs. The dock was supposed to be empty. I fast-forwarded through the early hours. The dock remained empty. The camera's field of view captured the entire fuel dock, the shed entrance, and a wide expanse of Lake Superior beyond the breakwater. Around 01:30, the drizzle solidified into sleet, a fine, icy rain that tracked sideways across the frame edges, blurring the distant shore lights. The wind was picking up, but according to the marina's weather station readout, it remained under 5 knots. Yet I could hear the mournful metallic clang of the lake bell, anchored out past the channel marker. It rang with an unnerving regularity for such light conditions. I made a mental note to recheck the wind speed later, thinking perhaps the local sensor was off. Then, at 2:17:34, it happened. A sharp, 2-note whistle cut through the hiss of the sleet and the distant bell. Distinct, clear, unmistakable. I paused the footage. I knew that sound. It was the specific call used by the marina for decades. Dock hands on. A signal for all available crew to report to the fuel dock, usually for an unexpected mooring or an emergency. But the night log said no crew. No one. I rewound, played it again. The sound was crisp, localized, as if coming from just out of frame, or perhaps from the very edge of the dock itself. My eyes scanned the screen. Nothing. Only the sleet, a shifting veil of ice crystals, and the constant, lonely clang of the lake bell. The fuel shed door remained closed, its padlock, still present on the footage, glinting dully in the low light. I zoomed in, pushing the old system's resolution to its limit. The image pixelated, but I could still discern the individual sleet pellets streaking past. No figure, no shadow, no movement that could account for the whistle. I checked the camera's specifications. It was a fixed mount, 180-degree coverage, audio pickup sensitive to within 30 feet. The whistle sounded like it was within that range. The contradiction gnawed at me. A clear, human-made signal, specific to this location, with no human source. I reread the night log, my finger tracing the blank lines for the 2:100 to 3:100 hour. No entries. Absolutely none. The protocol for logging personnel was strict, a critical component of our safety and environmental compliance checks. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a fundamental breakdown if someone had been there. I played the segment again and again. The whistle, the sleet, the bell. The sound was so deliberate, so purposeful. I remembered a summer job years ago, working a small fishing charter out of a similar dock. The lake was always so clear then, the air sharp with pine and fresh water. We'd use hand signals and a similar whistle for close-quarters maneuvering. It was a system built on trust and immediate response. This echo felt like a mockery of that. I decided to check the wind speed readout again, carefully this time. I had thought it was under 5 knots, but perhaps I'd misread the digital display in my initial scan. My eyes narrowed, focusing on the small screen beside the main monitor. 4.7 knots. My initial reading was correct. The bell's ringing was genuinely anomalous for such low wind. Lake Superior is vast, and sometimes strange currents or microclimates can cause localized effects. But a consistent, strong clang from a buoy bell in near-calm conditions felt wrong. I fast-forwarded the footage from 2:17:34. The sleet continued. The bell continued. At 2:21:09, the fuel shed door, previously closed, was now visibly ajar. The padlock was gone. The transition was instantaneous. One frame locked, the next open. There was no visible hand, no tool, no shadow, no figure approaching or leaving the door. Just the sleet, the bell, and the open shed. and the silence where the whistle had been. The camera had recorded the result of an action, but not the action itself. The protocol of visual confirmation, so central to incident investigation, had failed completely. I reviewed the footage for the entire duration, looking for any other anomalies. Nothing. No other whistles, no other inexplicable movements. Just the empty dock, the sleet, and the distant, relentless clang of the bell. The case would be filed as unexplained. The lock was gone, the shed had been opened, and an auditory signal meant for human response had been given, all without a single visual trace of an individual. All I had was the cold, hard data. The whistle, the open door, and the unyielding emptiness of the frame. The echo of that whistle seemed to hang in the cold air of the office. A sound without a source, a message without a sender, carried on the sleet-laden wind across the dark waters of Lake Superior. For 32 years, I've worked the waterways of New Hampshire, first as a guide, then specializing in seasonal transitions. My John boat, a 16-foot aluminum hull, is my office. I know these kettle ponds like the back of my hand. Their depths, their currents, their moods. Early November is a tricky time. The water is still open, but overnight temperatures can drop hard, frosting the surface with skim ice. My protocol is always the same. Check the forecast twice, pack a satellite phone, and never push more than 50 yards into new ice without a clear, open path behind you. Today, the air was sharp, a biting 0 degrees Celsius, but the sun promised to burn off the morning chill. I launched at sunrise, the lake a sheet of gunmetal gray, reflecting the bare branches of the surrounding pines. The Raymar 1400 fish finder was already humming, its transducer sending pulses into the cold water. I pushed the boat slowly, the blunt bow breaking the thin, crystalline crust with a soft, tearing sound. It was satisfying, the way the ice fractured into perfect polygons, sliding aside. I aimed for the first cove, a familiar spot where the thermocline held steady, a good place for pickerel this time of year. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a distinct autumn scent that always brought a sense of calm. The sun climbed, painting the eastern shore in pale gold. My routine was methodical. I'd push a length, stop, let the boat drift, scan the sonar, then push again. It was slow work but productive. About 30 yards into the cove, the fish finder registered something unusual. Not a school of baitfish, not a submerged log. This was a single, elongated return, moving slowly. It held a consistent depth, roughly 12 feet down, and maintained an unnerving parallel course to my hull. Its speed was minimal, maybe half a knot, moving against the subtle flow I knew existed even in these still waters. I adjusted the gain, then the frequency, trying to clarify the image. It remained a thick, slow-moving line, too uniform for a large fish, too fluid for a sunken branch. I glanced at the screen, then back at the water. Nothing visible. The ice here was a little thicker, maybe a quarter inch, but still easily broken with the boat's momentum. I leaned into the oars, pushing a little harder. The starboard oar, a heavy ash model, scraped against something just below the surface. Not a crunch, more of a brittle, like striking a pane of glass. It was unexpected. I pulled the oar back, checking the blade for damage. Nothing. I looked over my shoulder, back the way I'd come. The channel I'd just broken, The dark, wet path through the skim ice was gone. Already, a new, opaque sheet had formed, sealing the water behind me. It wasn't just thin skim. It was solid, too thick to break by simply reversing course. The morning's light breeze had died, and the temperature had plummeted faster than the forecast predicted. I'd made a mistake, pushing too far without monitoring the refreeze rate. My escape route was sealed. Panic, a cold, sharp jab, hit me. I tried to push an oar into the new ice. It held firm, groaning under the pressure. I was stuck. The only way out was forward, deeper into the cove, where the ice was even thicker. I pulled out my satellite phone. No signal. The low, rolling hills around this pond always made reception spotty, but I usually got a bar or two. The screen was blank. The cold had drained the battery faster than I'd anticipated. Another miscalculation. I turned back to the fish finder. The anomaly was still there, still tracking parallel to the hull, still moving upstream against the slight current. It was closer now, perhaps 10 feet down. It pulsed. A thick, dark band on the display. It was too long, too smooth. Its movement too deliberate. I remembered a time years ago when my father and I had fished this very cove, reeling in a stringer full of fat yellow perch. The sun had been warm on our faces, the air alive with the buzz of insects. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different world. I tried to break the ice again, using the full weight of my body on the oar, slamming it down. The ice cracked, but didn't give way enough for the boat to pass. The sound was loud in the sudden stillness, a sharp report that echoed off the frozen shore. On the fish finder, the dark band twitched, then dipped slightly, as if reacting to the vibration. It then resumed its slow, steady pace. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The sun was higher now, but it offered no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving light on the expanding ice. The boat creaked, settling deeper into its frozen trap. I could feel the cold seeping up from the hull. I watched the sonar screen, my eyes fixed on the moving shape. It was now directly under the boat, a wide, solid mass filling the bottom third of the display. It was utterly still, mirroring my own immobility. The depth reading fluctuated, as if the bottom itself was moving. 12 feet. 10 feet. Then, abruptly, it dropped to 25 feet, then back to 12, then to 0, as if the transducer was suddenly in open air. The fish finder, usually so reliable, was glitching. Then, the shape began to oscillate, a gentle, rhythmic pulse, expanding and contracting on the screen. It wasn't moving away. It was just there, underneath. I leaned over the gunwale, peering into the murky water, but the ice was too opaque, the light too weak to penetrate. All I could see was my own reflection, distorted and pale, framed by the cold, unforgiving surface. The rhythmic pulsing on the fish finder continued, a silent beat beneath the skim. I was trapped, sealed in, with whatever that thing was, directly below. I have been on night watch at this marina for 11 years. A decade spent observing the rhythm of the tides, the shift of the seasons, and the predictable hum of machinery. This cove in southeast Alaska is my beat, a stretch of floating docks, a handful of permanent houseboats, and the transient slips that fill with fishing vessels from spring through fall. My tools are simple: a flashlight, a logbook, a handheld VHF radio, and the marina's central monitoring system, which tracks everything from power consumption to the status of the main dock generator. It's a quiet job, mostly, punctuated by the groan of ice in winter and the occasional late-night arrival. I know the sounds of this place better than my own breathing. My shift starts at 2000. By 02, the temperature had dropped to 17 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze was pushing freezing spray across the main float. I'd already made my rounds, checking mooring lines for chafe, clearing ice from cleats, and ensuring shore power was stable for the few boats still wintering over. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of brine, mixed with the faint, comforting exhaust of a distant diesel engine. I was back in the warm office, sipping coffee, reviewing the system logs. The marina's primary power comes from shore, but we have a robust diesel generator on the main dock, a Cat C18, that kicks in automatically if the grid drops or voltage fluctuates. It's a reliable unit, well-maintained, and its event log is usually a picture of uneventful readiness. A typical entry would show an auto start, a runtime, and an auto shutdown. It's a critical piece of infrastructure, ensuring continuous power to the boats, especially those with sensitive electronics or liveaboards relying on heat. The protocol is clear. Any unscheduled generator activity gets a manual check and a log entry in my physical book. At 0218, the digital log flashed. Generator auto start. I watched the system monitor. The unit spun up, the familiar rumble vibrating faintly through the pilings and up into the office. It ran for 12 seconds, then generator auto shutdown. A brief power flicker, barely noticeable. I made a mental note to check the grid stability, probably a minor transient. It happens. Sometimes a fishing trawler coming into port will draw a momentary surge, or a distant substation will hiccup. I was reaching for my logbook, pen poised, when at 2:19 the screen flashed again. Generator auto start. The rumble returned, just as before. This was unusual. 2 auto starts within a minute, especially for such short durations, pointed to a more significant power anomaly, or, less likely, a glitch in the generator's control module. I watched the screen, waiting for the shutdown. It came, again, after about 15 seconds. But this time, a second entry immediately followed. Manual override. I blinked. Manual override. The generator was set to auto. No one else was on duty. I was the only one with access to the control panel, and I hadn't touched it. I pulled up the detailed event log. The timestamp for the manual override entry was identical to the auto shutdown at 2:19:34. It was as if the system registered an auto shutdown, then someone immediately forced a manual override on a unit that was already off. This contradicted the very definition of an override. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my handheld VHF. "Marina night watch, checking generator," I muttered into the radio. Just for procedure, though no one was listening on our private channel. The air outside was colder now, the spray thickening. As I stepped onto the main dock, the freezing mist immediately coated my jacket. The generator shed loomed, a squat, insulated structure. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of houseboat mooring lines against their hulls, the sound that usually meant a slow, gentle swell. But the cove was flat calm, the water's surface like black glass reflecting the distant navigation lights. The tapping was too regular, too insistent for natural movement. I unlocked the shed door. The air inside smelled faintly of diesel and warm metal, but the generator was silent, its massive engine cooled to the touch. I checked the local control panel. Its display confirmed the recent auto starts and shutdowns. No error codes. Then I scrolled through the local event log. There it was. 02-1934. Auto shutdown. And directly below it, 02-1934. Manual override. The log was identical to the central system. It wasn't a transmission error. Someone, or something, had sent a manual override command to a generator that had just shut itself down automatically. It didn't make sense. A human operator would simply let the auto shutdown complete, or manually shut it down if it was running. They wouldn't override an already completed shutdown. I pulled out my phone, intending to call the supervisor, but hesitated. It was 02:30. What would I even report? The generator logged a manual override that didn't happen? It sounded like fatigue. I'd once spent a long shift convinced a buoy light was flashing the wrong pattern, only to realize I'd misread my own chart. I decided to recheck the main power grid readings first, to see if there was any instability that could have caused a cascade of phantom signals. As I walked back towards the office, I noticed the frost. It wasn't just on the deck planks. It was growing from the shore outward, a delicate filigree of ice crystals spreading across the dock surface, moving against the direction of the wind. It was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a time-lapse of winter setting in. Normally, the spray would freeze evenly, or the wind would sculpt it. This was different, almost organic in its progression. Back in the office, I keyed the VHF to channel 16, the International Hailing and Distress Frequency. Just a habit sometimes to listen to the static, a reminder of the vastness outside. The channel was usually quiet this time of night, especially in winter. But then, a burst of static, followed by a clear, disembodied voice. "This is Kilo Delta 179er, standing by on 16. My coffee cup clattered against the console. Kilo Delta 179er. That was the call sign for the old Coast Guard station, decommissioned almost a year ago. Its equipment had been removed, its frequency reallocated. No one should be transmitting from it. Not now. Not ever. The voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like a recording. It repeated the ID, then silence, just static. I grabbed the microphone, my hand shaking slightly. "Station calling on 16, identify yourself. This is Marina Night Watch." Only static answered. I tried again, louder. Nothing. I looked at the generator log, then at the VHF. The frost was still spreading, visible through the office window, forming intricate patterns on the glass. The tapping of the mooring lines continued, a steady, unnatural beat. The generator event log still showed the impossible manual override. It was a contradiction etched in digital ink, a system recording an action that could not have occurred. I thought of a summer evening, years ago, watching a family of otters play near the docks, their calls echoing across the quiet water. A simple, peaceful memory, starkly contrasted by the cold, mechanical dread now settling in. I picked up the supervisor's number, my finger hovering over the call button. What could I tell them? That a ghost station was hailing on the VHF? That the generator had overridden itself? That the frost was growing backwards? I lowered the phone. There was no protocol for this, just the cold, the tapping, and the silent, impossible log entries. My shift still had hours to go. For over a decade, I've been appraising properties across Vermont. My work takes me into every corner of the state, from bustling town centers to the most isolated backwoods. Each property has a story, but most are mundane. Market value, structural integrity, comparable sales. My tools are standard: a ruggedized tablet for data entry, a laser measurer, a high-resolution phone camera, and a set of master keys that opens more doors than most people would imagine. Today's assignment was a foreclosure, a lakeside cottage nestled deep in the woods, the kind of place that always looks more idyllic on paper than it does in late November. The drive-in was long, the gravel road narrowing to a single track, then to little more than a pair of ruts winding through dense stands of pine and leafless hardwoods. The air was still, sharp with the scent of frozen earth and damp leaves, and a thick hoarfrost coated everything, turning the landscape into a grayscale photograph. My arrival time, 11:37 a.m., was logged on the tablet. The property, a modest two-bedroom built in the 70s, sat on a small rise overlooking a partially frozen lake. Stone steps, slick with ice, led up to the front door. My standard procedure for vacant properties, especially those off the beaten path, begins with a full exterior perimeter check. This isn't just about documenting condition. It's a safety protocol. I look for signs of vandalism, squatters, or anything that might indicate an unsafe entry. My rule is simple. If there's any clear evidence of recent, unauthorized occupation or active danger, I document it, retreat, and report. I do not enter. This rule has kept me out of trouble more than once. As I rounded the northeast corner of the house, heading towards the lake-facing side, I noticed a window boarded up with rough-cut plywood. Not uncommon for a winterized cottage, or one that's seen some neglect. I pulled out my phone for a closer shot, zooming in on the edges. That's when I saw them. Fresh pry marks. Not from the outside, but clearly originating from the inside, forcing the plywood outward, splintering the frame around the nails. The wood itself was raw, unpainted, suggesting a recent, hasty job from within. My breath plumed white in the cold air. This wasn't vandalism. This was an exit. My internal safety alarm went off, but a stubborn part of me, wanting to complete the exterior assessment before calling it in, urged caution. I needed more data, something concrete for the report beyond just pry marks. This was my mistake. a small lapse in judgment driven by a desire for thoroughness. I took a series of photos, documenting the angle and depth of the marks. On the sill, beneath where the plywood had been, a faint, dark ring stained the paint. Kerosene, a lantern, and it looked recent. The faint smell of burnt fuel still lingered, almost imperceptible in the frigid air. I scanned the ground. The hoarfrost was pristine in most places, but near the window a set of boot prints. They weren't leading to the window, or even to the house from the driveway. Instead, they cut a path around the house, a deliberate arc through the frosted grass, as if someone had been circling or avoiding a direct approach. The prints were sharp, implying they were made recently, before the last layer of frost had fully settled. My gaze drifted to the lake. The shore ice was thick, gray and still, but a series of distinct cracks spiderwebbed outward from the bank directly behind the house, stretching perhaps 50 yards before disappearing under a thin layer of fresh snow. A single, clear set of boot prints, matching those around the house, led directly to the edge of the ice, then vanished. The cracks were new, not old stress fractures. They led away. The hair on my arms stood up. I was alone, miles from the nearest paved road. My phone, a lifeline, showed 2 bars. I pulled it out, trying to dial dispatch. The call wouldn't connect, ringing once before cutting out. I tried again, same result. The remote signal was too weak, a common issue in these valleys. My protocol for communication had failed. I decided to retreat. No interior assessment today. I backed away slowly, keeping the house in my peripheral vision, eyes scanning the surrounding woods. That's when I heard it. A low, steady hum, barely audible over the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. It wasn't the wind. It was an engine. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the trailhead, about a quarter-mile back down the gravel road. I froze, listening. The hum was consistent, idling. I remembered a summer trip to a similar lake as a kid, the sound of crickets and distant loons, the comforting drone of my father's boat. This hum was different, menacing in its stillness. I moved faster now, not quite running, but with purpose. My heart hammered. When I reached the small, unmarked clearing that served as the trailhead parking, I saw it. A dark-colored pickup truck, older model, parked at an odd angle. Its engine was running, exhaust pluming faintly in the cold. There were no license plates, none at the front, none at the back. The windows were dark, tinted, and I couldn't see inside. I walked past it, trying to appear casual, my hand tight on my phone, still useless. Every instinct screamed that I was being watched, that the truck had been waiting. The hum of its engine filled the silence, a constant, unsettling presence. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, forcing myself to maintain a steady pace, until I was well past the truck, until the sound of its idling engine was swallowed by the vast, silent woods. I didn't stop until I reached the paved road, miles away. The truck was not behind me. I pulled over, my hands shaking, and tried dispatch again. This time it connected. I reported the unplated vehicle, the pry marks, the lantern, the footprints, the ice. The dispatcher was calm, professional, but offered no immediate answers. They would send a unit to investigate. I waited, but no unit ever called me back for more details. The incident report I filed later was detailed, clinical, but it couldn't capture the cold dread of that place. The feeling of being an intruder in a story already in progress. A story that had perhaps just started, and whose ending I was nowhere near understanding. I've spent 12 years with the USGS Water Resources Division, most of that time focused on the Great Lakes Basin. My job is to monitor the pulse of these inland oceans, to measure every rise and fall, every flow and current. It's methodical work, often solitary, especially during the winter months. We rely on a network of automated gauges, some fixed on piers, others submerged, all feeding data back to our systems. The lake is predictable, mostly. Wind drives the waves, barometric pressure shifts the surface, and ice locks everything down. We have models for all of it. That's why the alert that came in at 0417 last Tuesday was so jarring. Our primary gauge in a quiet Lake Michigan embayment registered a 2-foot water level surge overnight. A significant event, usually indicative of a strong seiche. The problem? Local weather stations reported sustained wind speeds under 3 miles per hour. Barometric pressure had been stable for the last 24 hours. There was no seismic activity. Nothing in the meteorological data explained a 2-foot surge. My first thought was sensor malfunction. It happens. Ice can foul a pressure transducer, or a data logger might glitch. I pulled up the raw telemetry, cross-referencing it with the backup sensor's output. Both showed the same pattern. A rapid, almost vertical rise of 2.1 feet, holding for approximately 30 minutes, then a slow, steady fall back to baseline over the next 2 hours. A perfectly formed seiche, but without a visible driver. It looked too clean, too precise, given the lack of external force. My supervisor agreed. "Go put eyes on it," they instructed. "Check for ice damage, confirm the readings with a manual dip, run a diagnostic." Standard protocol. The drive out to the embayment was cold and clear, the kind of deep winter day where the sun feels like a decoration. The air temperature was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The access road was plowed, but the last quarter mile to the pier was a sheet of packed snow and ice. I parked the truck, loaded my gear, ice auger, current meter, a heavy-duty tripod, and my diagnostic laptop, and started the trek. The embayment was a picture of frozen stillness. The surface of the water was a vast, unbroken expanse of gray ice, stretching out to the distant, white-capped horizon of the main lake. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the snow. As I approached the old steel pier, the silence deepened. The pier itself was beautiful and menacing, encased in a thick layer of rime ice. Every railing, every bolt, every rung of the access ladder was welded in frost, its edges smoothed into ghostly white curves. The metal groaned faintly under the weight of the ice as I walked. I remembered a summer day years ago on a similar pier, watching children jump into the cool water, their laughter echoing. Today, the only echo was the wind in my own ears. I reached the gauge housing, a sturdy steel box bolted to the pier pilings. The external temperature sensor confirmed the extreme cold. No visible damage, no signs of impact. My breath plumed in front of me. I pulled out my ice auger, a heavy 2-stroke, and drilled a hole through the foot-thick ice next to the gauge. The ice was solid, no cracks or heaving that might suggest a localized pressure event. Using a calibrated tape, I measured the water level manually. It matched the gauge's current reading precisely. The sensor was accurate. That meant the 2-foot surge had been real. I scanned the boathouses lining the shore. Sure enough, halfway up the main door of the nearest one, A dark, distinct wet line marked where the water had reached. It was exactly 2 feet above the current level. Physical evidence confirmed the data. My gaze drifted further out into the embayment. The red bell buoy, usually a familiar sentinel, was off its charted position. It had drifted several yards against the faint, normal current of the embayment, its bell clapper frozen solid. It was a minor detail, but it snagged my attention. A buoy doesn't just drift against the current unless something is pushing it, or the current itself has reversed. I set up my tripod and deployed the acoustic Doppler current profiler into the auger hole. I wanted to see if there were any residual currents, any lingering turbulence from the seiche. The display on my laptop showed faint, oscillating flows, but nothing consistent. Nothing strong enough to explain the buoy's displacement. The water was settling, but the buoy was still off. I made a note to check its anchor later, assuming a fluke. My mind was already moving to the next step, downloading the high-frequency raw data directly from the sensor's internal memory. This would give me a much finer resolution than the telemetry log. As I connected my laptop to the gauge's data port, I felt a subtle vibration through the steel-piered deck plates. It was too low to be wind, too regular to be ice shifting. A deep hum, almost imperceptible. I pressed my gloved hand against the cold metal. The vibration was there, a faint rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from deep within the water. It wasn't strong enough to register on any of my instruments. More of a bone-deep resonance. I focused on the data download. The raw log was massive, recording water level every second. I started scrolling through it, looking for anomalies in the pre-surge data. And there it was. Not a clean, sudden rise, but a series of minuscule, rapid oscillations in the minutes leading up to the main surge. Tiny, almost imperceptible ripples. Each only a fraction of an inch, but occurring at a frequency that was entirely unnatural for an open body of water. They weren't waves. They were too fast, too regular. They looked more like the output of a precise mechanical vibration than a natural phenomenon. I checked the timestamp. These micro-fluctuations began exactly 37 minutes before the main 2-foot surge, and they stopped abruptly as the water began its rapid rise. It was as if something had been building, testing, before releasing an enormous, silent push. I tried to call my supervisor to report the new data, but my satellite phone showed no signal. The extreme cold, perhaps, or a localized dead zone. The protocol for escalating unusual findings was to report immediately, but I was cut off. The phone was dead, a rare occurrence. I had to abandon that protocol for now. The rhythmic hum from the pier seemed to intensify, just slightly. I pulled my hand away from the cold steel. The current meter, still in the water, showed a brief, anomalous spike in velocity, a sudden, deep current that lasted only a few seconds, then vanished. The surface of the ice remained perfectly still. There was no visible disturbance, no sound of rushing water, only the silent data telling a different story. I packed up my gear, the downloaded data secured on my laptop. The lake was still, a vast white sheet under the pale sun. But the data didn't lie. A 2-foot surge had occurred without wind, without pressure, driven by an unknown, silent force that had pre-signaled its arrival with minute, mechanical tremors. As I walked back to the truck, I glanced back at the bell buoy. It had drifted even further now, a silent, red sentinel against the white ice, still fighting an invisible current, its bell frozen in a perpetual, soundless alarm. The lake had moved, and I had no explanation for how. I've been the town electrician for this reservoir district for 20 years. You learn the rhythm of a place in that time, the way the grid hums, the specific groan of old transformers in winter, the reliable flicker of the navigation lights on the timber boathouses. My territory stretches from the main dam down to the old logging piers, all of it fed by a patchwork of lines that predate my grandfather. I know every junction box, every buried conduit, every timer cabinet by feel. My truck carries a full complement: multimeter, thermal imager, laptop with diagnostic software, and enough spare parts to rebuild a small substation if needed. The call came in at 0217 on a Tuesday, freezing drizzle just starting to bead on the windshield. Dispatch reported erratic operation on the far pier lights, the ones marking the channel entrance to the Old North Dock. Standard procedure: acknowledge call, log time, grab my heavy coat and head out. It was a routine service call. Probably a faulty relay or some moisture ingress in a lamp assembly. Nothing I hadn't seen 100 times. The drive out to the reservoir was quiet, just the shush of tires on wet asphalt. The air smelled sharp, like ozone and wet pine needles. When I pulled up to the main boathouse, the first thing I noticed was the lack of reliable rhythm. The far pier, about 300 yards across the water, usually displayed a steady, alternating green-white flash, a simple, comforting pulse. Tonight it was a chaotic jumble. Not just random flickers, but distinct bursts, short and long, repeating. It looked almost deliberate. I parked and made my way to the main timer cabinet, a weather-beaten steel box bolted to the side of the boathouse. This cabinet controls all the pier lighting, navigation markers, and the small cluster of floodlights for the loading dock. My core protocol for any lighting issue starts here. Verify input power, check the internal logs, and, most importantly, confirm the status indicator. If the system is running correctly, that main status LED should be a solid, unwavering green. It's the truth teller. I keyed open the cabinet, the hinges groaning softly in the cold. Inside, the circuit boards glowed faintly. I scanned the diagnostic display. System nominal. Power readings were stable. No fault codes. And there it was, the main status LED, glowing a confident, unblinking green. But the far pier lights were still wrong. I stepped back, my breath fogging, and watched. The patterns weren't random at all. They were distinct pairings of short and long flashes, repeating in sequences. Dot dash dot dot. Dash dash dot. Dot dash dot dot. It was like a fragmented rhythm, building, pausing, then repeating. The longer I watched, the more it coalesced into something unsettlingly familiar, like the cadence of a spoken word. It felt like someone's last name, spelled out in Morse code, over and over. This was a violation of the system's very purpose. These lights were for navigation, not communication. I pulled out my work tablet, intending to run a deeper diagnostic, a full system sweep. As I typed, I noticed something else. Tiny, Perfect beads of ice were forming along the rubber gasket of the cabinet door, even though the drizzle had stopped. The air temperature was just at freezing, but this was happening quickly, almost visibly. I glanced at the old river clock mounted on the boathouse wall. A large, round face that had kept time for the reservoir community for generations. Its minute hand jumped. Not smoothly, but in a series of tiny, hesitant jerks. I checked my own watch. 2:41. The river clock read 2:35. 6 minutes off. It was never off. I remembered fishing here as a kid. My grandfather always setting his watch by that clock. It was a constant. My first thought was my next move was to try a manual override, a protocol I usually avoid, without first documenting every possible detail. But the lights were so insistent, so wrong, and that clock was nagging at me. I tried to force the system into a standard sequence via the cabinet's manual controls. The buttons clicked, the internal relays hummed, but the far pier lights continued their strange, repeating Morse. The system was accepting my input, but ignoring it. The protocol for manual intervention had failed. I decided to document everything. I set up my phone on a small tripod, aiming it at the cabinet's internal display, focusing on the green status LED and the diagnostic readouts. I also started a separate time-lapse video, pointing it across the water at the far pier lights, hoping to capture the full sequence. The cold was seeping into my bones, and my fingers felt clumsy. I might have accidentally nudged the power button on the thermal imager, draining its battery slightly. A small mistake I usually never made. I waited, shivering, for about 30 minutes, letting the time-lapse run. The ice beads on the gasket had grown noticeably thicker, forming a delicate, crystal fringe. The river clock continued to tick, now 7 minutes behind. The pier lights pulsed their message. When I reviewed the time-lapse, the contradiction was stark. The cabinet's green status LED remained solid and unwavering for the entire duration, indicating perfect system health. The diagnostic screen consistently reported system nominal. Yet, in the other video, the far pier lights continued their rhythmic, unsettling pattern. A clear, persistent deviation from standard operation. The light sequence, when sped up, became even more pronounced. The deliberate, repeating message undeniable. And in the background of that second video, the river clock's minute hand jumped again, losing another minute. I called dispatch, my voice tight. Unit 1 reporting inexplicable system behavior at the main reservoir boathouse. Lights are cycling out of sequence, no fault codes, and the primary timer cabinet shows solid green. There's also a significant discrepancy with the river clock. Understood, Unit 1, dispatch replied, their voice calm. Log the incident. Supervisor will review in the morning. Anything else? The lights, I said, my gaze fixed on the glowing green LED that lied. They're still doing it, and I can't make them stop. I couldn't explain it. The system was reporting perfect operation, yet it was clearly malfunctioning in a highly specific, almost intelligent way. The time-lapse footage was undeniable proof of the paradox. There was no physical fault, no error code, just a fundamental, chilling disconnect between what the system reported and what it actually did. The sequence was wrong, and I had no way to make it right. I spent 32 years on the Puget Sound ferries, mostly as a deckhand. You learn the water. Not just the navigation lanes or the currents, but the rhythm of it, the way it breathes. I knew the tide tables better than my own schedule. Even in retirement, living in a small cove house on the Kitsap Peninsula, that knowledge sticks. I still check the charts daily. A habit, like having a first cup of coffee before the sun clears the Olympics. It's about knowing what the water is doing, what it's capable of. This past Tuesday, the fog rolled in thick before dawn. It wasn't the usual marine layer that burns off by 9. This was a dense, heavy blanket, muffling the world. The kind of fog that swallows sound, makes the pilings along the public float disappear into gray before you get within 20 feet. Even the distant moan of the foghorns from the shipping lanes was absent, absorbed by the oppressive stillness. I brewed coffee and checked the tide chart for our local cove. Low tide was predicted at 0617, a negative 1.2 feet. A good, deep low, exposing plenty of barnacled rock and oyster beds. After my coffee, around 0630, I decided to walk down to the public float just to observe. It's a quiet spot normally. The air was cold, damp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of brine mixed with the faint, almost sweet smell of creosote from the old pilings. Visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. I moved slowly, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots. When I reached the float, the water was exactly where it should have been for a negative 1.2 tide, pulling back from the barnacle line on the pilings. But something else caught my eye. Something that didn't fit. On the exposed mudflats, extending out from the base of the float, were a series of fresh footprints. They weren't the prints of gulls or raccoons. These were human, and they went too deep. My eyes went immediately to the waterline. The prints started at the edge of the water, precisely where the current low tide marked its boundary. But they continued, distinct and clear, further out onto the mud, into ground that, by all rights, should have been submerged. I knelt, tracing the outline of a boot print with a gloved finger. It was a size 10 or 11, a work boot, deep tread. The mud here was still slick, indicating very recent passage. My internal clock, honed by decades of observing the sound, told me this was wrong. The tide had been rising for 13 minutes. For those prints to be visible, the person had to have walked there when the water was significantly lower than the predicted negative 1.2 feet. This violated a fundamental rule of the sound. The tide charts are accurate. They are the Bible for navigation, for docking, for everything. A deviation of a few inches, maybe. But these prints indicated a depth that was easily 6 to 8 inches below the charted low. It was like seeing a compass needle point south when it should point north. I pulled out the disposable camera I keep in my jacket pocket for documenting anything unusual. A broken mooring line, a drift log hazard. It was a cheap plastic thing, but reliable. I'd always trusted these simple point-and-shoots for their ruggedness, a holdover from my days documenting minor hull damage. I took a picture of the overall scene, the fog-shrouded float, the mudflats. Then I knelt again, getting a close-up of the deepest prints, trying to capture the impossible line where they ended at the current water's edge. The film advanced with a familiar clack. As I stood up, a sound reached me from directly beneath the float. Tap, 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 tap. It was metallic, rhythmic, and deliberate, like a wrench striking wood or metal. Not random, not the creak of the structure or the slap of waves. This was a cadence. 3 distinct strikes, a pause, then 3 more. It was coming from the dark, unseen space between the underside of the float and the water. My first thought was a maintenance worker, but no one works on the float this early, especially not in this fog, and certainly not under it at low tide. This public float was old, but structurally sound. I walked to the edge, peering into the gloom beneath the heavy timber planks. The water was dark, reflecting the gray fog. The pilings, encrusted with mussels, disappeared into the murky depths. The tapping continued, unwavering. Tap, 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 tap. It had a hollow resonance to it, as if the space it emanated from was enclosed. I remembered a cold morning on the Kaliton, heading into Bainbridge, the fog so thick you could taste it. I'd been on bow watch, the only sound the thrum of the engines and the occasional clang of the anchor chain being readied. It was a comfort then, the predictable sounds of the vessel. This tapping was anything but comforting. It was alien. I raised the camera again, intending to get a shot of the water directly below where the sound originated, just in case there was something visible, some anomaly. As my finger pressed the shutter button, a ripple erupted on the water's surface. It wasn't a circular ripple, like a stone dropped. It was long, narrow, and ran directly across the current, from one side of the float to the other, under the very spot the tapping originated. It moved with unnatural speed, flattening the surface for a brief instant before dissipating into the fog. At the exact moment the ripple crossed, the camera jammed. The film advance lever stuck solid, frame 24. I tried to force it, but the plastic mechanism resisted, threatening to break. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the fog itself. I stood there, the camera useless in my hand, staring at the now placid gray water beneath the float. The ripple was gone. The tapping was gone. Only the impossible footprints on the mudflats remained, stark evidence of something that defied the tide, defied the charts, defied everything I knew about the sound. I stood there for a long time, listening, but the only sound was the faint, muffled drip of condensation from the pilings. The fog clung to everything, obscuring, concealing. I had no evidence of the sound, no photograph of the ripple, only the undeniable fact of the footprints and the chilling certainty that something had been moving below the line, in a place the water shouldn't have allowed. For 2 decades, I've worked the ice in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My profession is ice rescue trainer for various regional agencies, fire departments, sheriff's deputies, SAR teams. I know the lakes, the currents, the way ice forms and breaks. I know the gear, dry suits, tether lines, ice awls, augers, the long-stemmed probes for testing thickness. We log everything: air temperature, water temperature, ice depth, wind speed, time of day. Protocols are etched into my brain. They have to be. Out here, the lake doesn't care about your experience or your certifications. This past winter, we were running a basic immersion and recovery drill on a back lake outside Munising. It was mid-February, steady snow falling, big flakes clinging to the pines. The air hung at a crisp 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect conditions for a controlled environment. The lake was quiet, just the muffled sounds of our gear and the wind in the trees. I remember the smell of pine sap, sharp and cold, a scent that always reminds me of childhood winters, building snow forts until my fingers ached. We'd cut a standard 4x4-foot hole near the shore, about 20 feet out. The ice was a solid 14 inches thick, clear blue, no fissures. Our standard practice dummy, a weighted dry suit, lay on the ice beside it. 2 trainees were suited up. The first trainee, a deputy from the county, was ready to enter the water. The second trainee, a volunteer SAR member, would act as backup and observer, ready to provide support from the ice. My safety observer, a seasoned state park ranger, stood on shore, whistle ready, monitoring the overall scene and communications. I had our training GoPro mounted on a tripod, angled to get a clear shot of the hole and the immediate recovery area. It was set to record continuously, feeding a live view to a small monitor I carried. I always double-check the timestamp on the GoPro against my own watch and the ranger's. It's a core protocol. We rely on precise timing for exposure limits and incident logs. Today my wristwatch read 11:37 a.m. The GoPro and the ranger's watch matched at 11:43 a.m. I made a mental note to adjust mine later, a minor oversight in the pre-drill setup. 6 minutes off. It was a small detail, easily overlooked in the cold and the routine. "All right," I called out, my voice carrying clearly across the still air. "First trainee, proceed to victim." The deputy moved with practiced caution, deploying their tether line, crawling to the hole. They entered the frigid water, a splash of dark against the white ice. The dummy was secured, and the recovery process began. The GoPro feed on my monitor showed the deputy working, the dark rectangle of open water clearly visible. Everything was proceeding as expected. The ranger on shore maintained visual contact, ready with the all-out signal if needed. As the first trainee was being hauled out, their movements slow and deliberate in the dry suit, I glanced at my monitor again. The GoPro feed flickered. For a fraction of a second, the open water in the hole appeared to be a solid, dark surface. I blinked, dismissing it as a brief interference, maybe a bit of condensation on the lens. The deputy was almost clear of the water. "First trainee clear," I radioed to the ranger. "Second trainee, prepare for entry." The second trainee, who had been kneeling a few feet away, began to shift. But something nagged at me. That flicker on the monitor. I stopped the second trainee. "Hold for a moment," I instructed. I walked to the edge of the hole, pulling out my long-stemmed thermometer probe. This device was designed to measure water temperature, extending deep below the surface. I knelt, expecting to dip it into 33-degree water. Instead, the probe hit something solid. I pressed harder. It didn't break through. The digital display on the probe read 28 degrees Fahrenheit. 28 degrees. Solid ice. My breath hitched. I scraped at the surface with the probe's tip. It was hard, slick. Not a thin skim, but a substantial layer. This was impossible. Ice doesn't form 14 inches thick in minutes. It doesn't even form a half-inch thick in minutes, not at 18 degrees air temperature. I looked at the dark surface, then at the GoPro feed. The monitor now clearly showed a uniform, unbroken white surface where the hole had been. The timestamp on the GoPro still read 11:43 a.m. From the shore, the sharp blast of the ranger's whistle cut through the quiet. "All out!" he yelled, his voice urgent. He blew the whistle again, 2 short, insistent blasts. All out! I looked back at the second trainee. They were still kneeling, motionless, their head bowed, their form almost blending with the falling snow. Their tether line, which should have been slack, lay taut, disappearing beneath the fresh powder, stretching out towards where the hole had been, towards the solid ice. "Second trainee," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Report!" No response. The ranger was waving frantically, pointing at the second trainee, then at the newly solidified ice. The first trainee, now fully out of the water and on their feet, looked confused, then alarmed. I scrambled to the second trainee's position. The snow around them was pristine, undisturbed. No footprints leading away. No disturbance where the tether line disappeared into the powder. I followed the line with my eyes. It seemed to pull from directly beneath the solid ice, under the untouched snow. I pulled out my phone, checking the time. 11:43 a.m. The same as the GoPro. The same as the ranger's watch. My wristwatch still read 11:37 a.m. 6 minutes. 6 minutes had passed since I'd last checked it. 6 minutes during which a 4x4-foot hole in 14-inch ice had apparently vanished, refrozen solid, without any visible disruption or sign of the person who had been kneeling beside it. We initiated an immediate search. First the 3 of us, then a full SAR team from the county. We cut new holes, ran sonar scans. The ice around the original drill site was consistently 14 inches thick. No signs of thin ice. No signs of a fall-through. No signs of struggle. The second trainee was gone. The tow rope, eventually cut and recovered, showed no fraying, no stress marks, just a clean, inexplicable break where it had disappeared beneath the snow. The official report stated a probable fall through thin ice, a tragic accident. But I know what I saw. I know the protocols. I know the ice. And the hole was gone.